How you doing there? Welcome back to Babble on Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Yudal, Daf 14 of Masechta Chullin. Friends, Daf 14 is mind-blowingly amazing. It's really, really awesome. There is like one. Oh, by the way, it's gonna be a cliffhanger. It's gonna be a cliffhanger. We're gonna. It's not shaykh to fit. It's not. It's not. There's no really good stopping point until tomorrow. So it's gonna be a bit of a cliffhanger, but. Oh boy, will we have such great stuff before we hang off that cliff. Anyways, there is one primary sugya on this daf, and that is eating an animal that was slaughtered on Shabbos. It's unbelievable because, this daf brings us back to Seder Moed. Seder Moed, with the exception of Brachos, which is the only Masechta in Shas from Seder Zroim, Seder Moed was when we were becoming friends. Seder Moed was coronavirus, was lockdowns. Seder Moed was Masechta Shabbos, Masechta Eruv, Masechta Beya. These are the sugyas we're learning today, friends. Shabbos, Yom Tiv, Eruvin, Breira. Oh. My heart is just so filled with love for these sugyas, right? So really the core sugya of today is eating an animal that was slaughtered on Shabbos. So if an animal is slaughtered on Shabbos, obviously you're not allowed to slaughter an animal on Shabbos, but someone did. Okay, is the shechita kosher? So that's besim the sugya. That is the sugya of today. However, along the way we will see a sugya about separating tithes from the wine of a kuti. That is the sugya of breira from Daf Lamed Vav Masechta Eruvin. Do you remember where you were for Daf Lamed Vav Masechta Eruvin? I remember where I was. For Daf Lamed Vav Masechta Eruvin. Eruv techumin, to see a visiting tzaddik. Unbelievable, related to the sugya of breira. Handling broken vessels on Shabbos. Unbelievable. And drinking fruit juice on Shabbos. Unbelievable. What a throwback daf. It's probably going to be a big one as my guess, but it's going to be so amazing. Friends, join me. Let's really, really enjoy ourselves here when we're learning Daf Yud of Masechta Chullin. Friends, we begin Daf Yud Omid Aleph all the way at the top at the Mishnah. Shoichid b'Shabbos u'v'Yom HaKippurim afal pi she'mischayv b'nafsho shchitaso kshera zeu. That is our Mishnah. 2 lines. I'll read them again. Hashoichid b'Shabbos u'Yom HaKippurim, somebody who shechts on Shabbos or on Yom Kippur, even though he's chayiv misa, right? Even on Yom Kippur, there's a chiyuv koris. The shchita nonetheless is a kosher shchita. Okay, so even though, yes, you violated Shabbos or Yom Kippur when slaughtering this animal, the shchita itself is kosher shchita. The meat is kosher none the less. Unbelievable. Says the Gemara, Amar Rav Huna, says Rav Huna, Darish Chia bar Rav, Chia the son of Rav, Darshan Mishmei the Rav, in the name of his father Rav, Asura ba'achila liyoma. Oh, okay. That, even though we're saying that the meat is nonetheless kosher, okay, so somebody slaughtered a sheep, let's say on Shabbos. I'm going to focus primarily on Shabbos just to choose one and focus on one thing. And I think it's a it's easier to use that as a topic. Yom Kippur is more specific. Anyways, so what do we say? So we said that if somebody slaughters, let's say a sheep, I'll use a sheep as an example. Somebody slaughters a sheep on Shabbos. So we say, even though you're chayav misa for chil Shabbos, but the sheep itself the meat is kosher. However, says Rav, Asur b'achila liyoma, you can't, it's muktzah, essentially. Well, it's let's not get into the reason why for now, but you are not allowed to eat it on Shabbos. You're going to have to wait until after Shabbos in order to eat it. V'naz ben chavrai l'meimer, and in the Beis HaMedrash, the Chevre, they wanted to say, Rabbi Yehuda, that Rav is saying this in accordance with Rabbi Yehuda. Zeu. This is, what we have done so far is be'etzem the premise for this daf. That one who slaughters an animal on Shabbos, even though he's chayiv misa for chil Shabbos, The shchita, nonetheless, is kosher shchita, obviously assuming that it was done kosherly. The animal is kosher. Says Rav, however, you can't eat it that day. You have to wait till after Shabbos. And in the Beis HaMedrash, they said that Rav was saying that in accordance with Rabbi Yehuda. I.e. that this is betzim Rabbi Yehuda's shita, that you'd have to wait until after Shabbos in order to eat this meat. And now the big question is, hey Rabbi Yehuda, which Rabbi Yehuda are we what shita of Rabbi Yehuda, what did Rabbi Yehuda ever say that we would conclude from there that Rav is saying like him, that Rav is saying like Rabbi Yehuda, that even though the meat is kosher, it would have to wait until after Shabbos, that on Shabbos you will be unable to eat this meat. We are going to, that's what's going to keep us busy, not just today, but tomorrow as well. Trying to figure out what shita of Rabbi Yehuda is this, that because of that shita, Rav is saying you can't eat the meat that day. Amr Babble, says Rabbi Yehuda, de'achonehi. It's Rabbi Yehuda of Muktzah. Rabbi Yehuda, when it comes to Muktzah, what does Rabbi Yehuda say about Muktzah? The Snam we learn in the Mishnah, Masechta Shabbos. Mechatchen es adiluin lifnei behema. You can cut up. I didn't look up what I'm pretty sure diluin are gourds. So we're going to go with gourds. Glass, right? It's gourd. So you can cut up gourds for to feed to animals on Shabbos. I took a look in the Shulchan Aruch that they point out that the point of gourds is that they would be the animal would be unable to eat the gourd unless you cut it up. It would be too difficult for them to eat. Otherwise, you have to cut it up for them. But if they could eat it without your intervention, then you just got to give it to them as is. Anyway, so you can cut up the gourds for animals, and here we go. Vesanevela lifnak klavin. Now, according to the Tanakama, if you have nevela, let's say you have a sheep that died that day. Let's say you have a sheep that died on Shabbos. You can, nonetheless, cut it up for your dogs to be able to eat it. So it's nevela. Mom should drop that on Shabbos, so it's nevela. You can, nonetheless, feed it to your dogs. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, im lo oisa nevela me'erev Shabbos, asura lefi she'ena min hamuchin. However, Rabbi Yehuda argues against the Tanakama and says that if this sheep died on Shabbos, so then you can't feed it to your dog. You can't cut it up to feed it to your dog because it's muktzah. If it was dead already before Shabbos, okay, so you have nevela. What are you going to do with this dead sheep that died? You'll feed it to your dog. So if it died before Shabbos, so when Shabbos came in, it was already dead. It was already essentially dog food. So you can cut it up and feed it to your dog on Shabbos. However, it says Rabbi Yehuda, if when Shabbos came in, this animal was alive, and we're going to talk about what the nafkaminas are with the animal being alive, but when Shabbos came in, the animal was alive, and it then died on Shabbos, and it became nevela on Shabbos, which means that, right, so when Shabbos came in, it was not yet dog food, let's say, and then it dies on Shabbos and becomes dog food on Shabbos. So Rabbi Yehuda says that you can't cut it up and feed it to your dog. Again, Rabbi Yehuda says, Rabbi Yehuda, im lo oisa nevela me'erev Shabbos, if it was not yet dead, if it was not yet nevela on Erev Shabbos, it only became nevela, it dropped dead and became nevela on Shabbos, and effectively became dog food on Shabbos. Asura, you can't feed it, cut it up and feed it to the dog. Lefi she'ena min hamuchin, because it is not prepared, it's muktzah. Alma kimdul itachen me'esmol asura. So we see that since this animal, this sheep, I'm going to say, it doesn't say sheep anywhere, I'm going to use sheep as an example. Since this sheep was not prepared as dog food from before Shabbos, and again, we're going to discuss in a minute, then what was it for before Shabbos? We're going to get into that very shortly. But suffice it to say that before Shabbos, it was not dog food. It only became dog food on Shabbos. It became nevela that you're going to feed to your dog on Shabbos. So it was not prepared before Shabbos. Therefore, it's asura. You can't feed it to the dog. So Achanami will say this, the same thing over here by this animal that was slaughtered on Shabbos. That even though it's chayv misa for the shechita, but we're saying the meat is kosher, but nonetheless, Rabbi Yehuda, we want to argue that Rabbi Yehuda would say that because it was not prepared to be eaten on Shabbos, so therefore you have to wait till after Shabbos. So Achanami here as well, well, since this slaughtered sheep was not ready to be eaten yesterday from before Shabbos, it wasn't slaughtered yet, Asura, it is forbidden. So Reb Abba wants to suggest that this is the Shita of Reb Yehuda about the nevela for the dogs, that we can learn from there that he would say that if somebody slaughters a sheep on Shabbos, even though it's kosher, you would be unable to eat it until after Shabbos, because it was not prepared before Shabbos. Abaye says to Reb Abba, I disagree with that analysis, argues Abaye. Hasamei kara muchin le'adam ve'hashta muchin le'klavim hachamei kara muchin le'adam ve'hashta muchin le'adam. Abaye disagrees with Reb Abba, and he says that the cases are different. The case of the nevela for the dog is different than the shchita for humans. Because, argues Abaye, why is a person raising sheep? A person is raising sheep for food. For food. And this sheep is being raised la'achilas adam, for human consumption. Now, if a sheep in his flock dies, so feed it to his dog, sure. But a live sheep is intended for human consumption. And therefore, argues Abaye, you see, when it comes to the dog, before Shabbos, that sheep was alive. And therefore, before Shabbos, that sheep was prepared for what? Prepared for human food, for human eating. On Shabbos, that sheep died. You woke up in the morning, the sheep died. I don't know, a wolf came and attacked it. The sheep was dead. So now you can't eat it. It's nevela. It's no longer over Shabbos, on Shabbos. This sheep now changed. It's no longer for human consumption. It's now for dog consumption. It's dog food now. So because when Shabbos came in, the sheep was still for human consumption, and then on Shabbos it became fit for dog consumption, that's why Rabbi Yehuda is saying it's muksa. It wasn't prepared for this purpose before Shabbos. It's muksa, you can't cut it up to feed it to the dog. But, argues Abaye, somebody slaughters a sheep on Shabbos, where, again, let's just get out of the way. Let's say it one last time. Yes, he's chayiv misa. Okay, great. We get that out of the way. He's chayiv misa. Fine. We know you're not allowed to, but he did it. Okay, we're gonna work from that point on. So we're saying the Mishnah had already said that the meat is kosher. Now we're talking about the nafkaminas, why you can't eat it on Shabbos. Now that we got that out of the way, we can focus on this from now on. Now, says Abaye that this meat, before Shabbos, this sheep was human food, was for human consumption. On Shabbos, after it's been slaughtered, it's still for human consumption. So Abaye argues that you can argue that according to Rabbi Yehuda, or certainly if we're just basing from this Mishnah alone, you can make the argument that according to Rabbi Yehuda, you could actually eat this meat since it was prepared for human consumption when Shabbos came in. Givaldi. To which Reb Abba responds, Misavrat behema bechayel lachila omedes? Why are you assuming that a live sheep, its purpose is for food? Abaye, why are you assuming that a sheep that is alive, its purpose is for food? Behema b'chayah ligadel omedes. It's for breeding. Reb Abba argues that a sheep is for breeding, not for eating. And therefore argues Reb Abba, in this case as well, before Shabbos, the sheep was alive, and its purpose was for breeding. On Shabbos it was slaughtered. Its purpose is now for eating. That would be muksa according to Rabbi Yehuda. It was not ready. Its purpose was not for eating when Shabbos came in. Therefore, it would be usher, argues Rabbi Iachi. Abai fires back. If the purpose of a live sheep is for breeding, behema l'Rabbi Yehuda b'yomtiv heichi shachtinan, then how, according to this, would Rabbi Yehuda say that you could slaughter a animal, a sheep, let's say, on Yom Tiv? You can add the two words that make it a little bit clearer. Muktzahi. It's muksa. Abai fires back and says, Rabbi Abba, if so, that a sheep is for breeding, well then on Yom Tiv, according to you, how would Rabbi Yehuda say that you could slaughter a sheep for your Yom Tiv Suda? The sheep is muktzah. It's for breeding. It's not for eating. Leave it alone. It's muktzah. It's not, if the sheep was for eating, so sure. Okay, ochel nefesh, you could slaughter, you can eat it. But Reb Abba, if the sheep is for breeding, so it's muktzah, how could you slaughter it on Yom Tiv? Lefi Reb Yehuda, however you're saying. Omar loy, so Reb Abba responds, Omedis la'achila ve'omedis ligadol. Here we go, friends. Here we go. Breira. Says Reb Abba, here's the dilio. A sheep, when it's alive, has two paths that it can take. The breeding path or the eating path. Now, of course, that is not up to the sheep. It's up to its owner. A sheep, when it's alive, can have one of two purposes in life. For breeding or for eating. Nishchato huvrara dilachila omedes lo nishchato huvrara diligadel omedes. Unbelievable. Reb Abba whips out breira. What is breira? Who wants to explain to us what breira is? I'm going to try to take a new angle on breira. I've never explained breira in this way. I'm going to take a new angle on breira. Breira is ashkocha protis. Breira is ashkocha protis. I'll give you an example. You have a flight from Tel Aviv to New York, and mamish, the train is delayed, you missed the train, whatever, you missed your flight. Chaval, gefährlich. So they put you on the next flight. And it's super annoying, you're waiting in the airport for 5 extra hours, whatever. You get on the next flight, and who are you sitting next to? Whatever, I'm making up an example. You're sitting next to your best friend growing up, you haven't seen them in 20 years, and because of that flight, now you rekindle your friendship. The rest of your life, you guys are like meatballs and spaghetti. Mamish best friends. Wow, ashkacha pratis. You know, it was meant to be milichatchila. It was meant to be. I was supposed to miss this flight so that I can catch this flight, and everything worked out perfectly. In retrospect, I see everything was min hashamayim. Everything worked out. Of course, I wasn't supposed to take the first flight. Of course, I was supposed to miss my flight. Of course, I was supposed to take that second flight. Everything we see in retrospect, everything worked out perfectly. Hashkacha pratis. So that's how I want to explain breira. What does this mean? It means that you have this sheep. A sheep, its purpose could be breeding. Its purpose can be eating. Okay. Now, we said that if the purpose of the sheep is for breeding, well then it will be muksa and Yom Tif. How can you slaughter? But if it's for eating, so then you could slaughter it. So Rabbi Abba wants to say, look, the sheep can go either way. From the fact that on Yom Tif, he slaughters it, so we could say, ashkacha pratis. Clearly, this sheep all along was meant to be for eating. That initially it could have gone either way. From the fact that on Yom Tif, he slaughters it for his Yom Tif Suda, of course, Mimele, the whole time, of course, this sheep was never meant for breeding. This sheep was meant for eating. When Yom Tif came in the night before, this sheep was an eating sheep. And you're slaughtering an eating sheep. From the fact that you fast forward 24 hours to Yom Tif afternoon, and you slaughter this sheep for Yom Tif Suda, clearly when Yom Tif had come in the night before, this was not a breeding sheep, this was a eating sheep. Givaldik. Breira. Masha'en ken on Shabbos. However, on Shabbos, when Shabbos comes in, so obviously you're not allowed to shecht on Shabbos. So when Shabbos comes in, this as far as this Shabbos is concerned, this sheep is muktzah because you're not allowed to slaughter on Shabbos. Therefore, as far as Shabbos is concerned, when Shabbos came in and this sheep was still alive, it was not clearly meant for eating on this Shabbos. As far as this we're concerned, when Shabbos came in, it was a breeding sheep, and therefore when you slaughter it on Shabbos, you slaughtered a breeding sheep because when Shabbos came in, it was muktzah as a breeding sheep. And therefore, when you slaughter it the next day on Shabbos, you slaughtered a sheep that when Shabbos came in, it was a breeding sheep, and it's muktzah, and therefore you can't eat it. So Rab Abba wants to say that this is a shaila of breira, that when it comes to Shabbos, because you're not allowed to slaughter on Shabbos, when Shabbos comes in, so Mamela, this sheep is still alive. It's not meant for you to be eating the sheep on Shabbos. And when you slaughter it, be'etzem you slaughtered a breeding sheep, and in smuksa you're not allowed to eat it. But on Yom Tif, where you are allowed to shecht for your Yom Tif Suda, so we'll say that the fact that on Yom Tif afternoon you shechted this sheep for your Yom Tif Suda means that Memele, the whole time, this was a eating sheep, and that's why you're allowed to eat it on Yom Tif. Amazing mahalach, beautiful mahalach. It really gets all of our koiches into this sugya, and we love it. There's one problem, and that's it's a big one. The problem is Rabbi Yehuda doesn't hold the breira. Rabbi Yehuda doesn't hold that in this case you'd be able to slaughter it on Yom Tif, and you see the whole time it was an eating sheep. Rabbi Yehuda doesn't say no breira. How do we know this? So we're going to give one attempt from the famous example of the kuti wine, the famous example of the kuti wine, and then we're going to reject that, and then we'll give another example from Eruv techumin. So example number one, right? A raya number one that will be rejected. Famous example we had in Eruv. So, how do we know that Yehuda does not hold a breira? Maybe it's from the following famous brisa that we've seen several times before. A person buys wine from kusim. Now, the kusim are not trustworthy whatsoever when it comes to trumas and meisos. They're not ama oretz. Ama oretz, you assume separated truma. You don't know about meisos, so misafik you separate meiser. No. Kusim did not separate anything. It's tevel. And what's the scenario? The scenario is that you have two yidden, and these two yidden need to travel far. Right, these two yidden they're taking a horse and a wagon. They hired a driver. They're taking a horse and a wagon. They're going to drive from Yerushalayim all the way down south to Eilat. I don't know, is Eilat part of it? Whatever. That's where they're going. They're going to Eilat. So these two yidden, 2,000 years ago in Eretz Yisrael, they hired a driver and took a horse and a wagon, and they had several hours ahead of them. And on the side of the road, they saw that a kuti was selling a barrel of wine, and he was selling a barrel of wine. And they said, "Oh, Givaldik, let's buy this barrel of wine from this kuti, and like this, we'll be able to have a fabrengen in the wagon all the way until we get to our destination." Now, I don't know if you can get to a lot in one afternoon on a horse and so instead let's say Beersheba. I don't know if you can get there in a horse and wagon either in one afternoon, but let's assume you can. Let's say he lives in Beersheba, right? They live in Beersheba, and they're traveling from Yerushalayim to Beersheba. They rent a wagon for the afternoon, and they have a wagon driver, and there's two yidden in the back of the wagon, and they say, here's a kuti, he's selling a barrel of wine. Let's buy this barrel of wine. We'll have a fabrengen the whole way there. Great idea. There's one problem, and that problem is that kutim don't separate nothing. not trumas, not meisters, not nothing. This wine is tevel. So what could they do so that they can have a farbrengen? Here's what they could do. They can say that, look, by the evening we'll be home. In 5 hours from now, 6 hours from now, at the end of our farbrengen, we'll be home. And says the one who buys the wine, let's call him Reuven, says Reuven, when I get home, the first thing I will do, there's 100 logs of wine, of tevel wine in this barrel. When I get home, the first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to take 2 logs, I'm going to put them aside, I'm going to give that to the kohen, truma. I'm then going to take 10 logs, and I'm going to put those aside, and those are going to be meiser. And in terms of meiser sheni, so he could take care of that now on the meiser sheni, because it'll just be poted onto money, and it'll bring that money to Yerushalayim. So he says, okay, then an additional 9 logs will be meiser sheni, right? Because be'etzem, what you do is you have 100 logs, so 2 of them are truma. So of the 98 that remain, 10% of that is meiser, so that's 9.8, which is rounded to 10. And then 10% so 98 minus 9.8 is 88.2, right? And then that divided by 10 is 8.82, which is rounded to 9. So basically the suggestion is, what he could do is, he could take, he says, when I get home, I'm going to separate 2 logs. So he says now in the wagon, those 2 logs of truma of wine that I'm going to separate as truma, I'm saying that right now, so let's treat them now as they're, right, those will be the truma. And the 10 logs that I'm going to separate when I get home as meiser, those are going to be the meiser. And in terms of the 9 logs that I'm going to separate as meiser sheni, I'll just be porting them onto money right now. And now that they got those technicalities out of the way, they haven't actually separated anything, because they don't have anything to separate with. They're in a wagon. What are they going to separate? How are they going to say? They don't have anything. They just bought a barrel of wine. They want to drink it. So what they do is they get those formalities out of the way. They say, when I get home, right? Reuven says, when I get home, 2 logs are going to be truma, 10 logs are going to be meiser. Right now, I'm going to be poured the meiser sheni onto money. Great. Now that we got that out of the way, l'chaim, let's farbreng, and they start mamish talking about the Daf Yomi and who knows what, anything you can imagine. They're getting closer to the Rabbanan Shalom with each mile. Now, givaldik. So what happens? So givaldik, they have a great time. The farbrengen is over. They get to Beersheba, and Reuven goes home, and the first thing he does is he takes 2 logs and he separates them as truma. And he takes 10 logs and separates them as meiser. Meiser sheni already dealt with. He doesn't have to do anything about that. And we say, breira, we say it's ashkocha pratis. Wow, those 2 logs that you separated as truma, it's mamish ashkocha pratis, because those 2 logs, those were the 2 logs in the barrel that were truma. And those 10 logs that you separated as meiser, oh my God, those were the 10 logs in the barrel that were supposed to be for meiser. How'd you do it? Unbelievable. It's ashkocha pratis. Everything worked out perfectly. We're going to say, breira, these were the 2 logs that all along were meant to be truma. Those were the 10 logs that all along were meant to be meiser. And all of the rest of the barrel, all the l'chaims that they had, all the way down to Beersheba, those were achulin. Everything worked out perfectly. So says the Braise, halakech yain mi ben akusim. So somebody who buys wine from the kusim and they don't have any way to separate trumas and meisers right now, Omer, he says, shnei logan shani osid leafrish, the 2 logs that I'm going to separate when I get home, hare and truma, those are truma. Asara meiserishan, and the 10 that I'm going to set aside when I get home, those are meiser rishon. That is meiser. Tisha, I'm now going to set aside, I'm now going to say that 9 of these logs, meiser sheni, are meiser sheni, umeichel, and he's poded them onto money. And now they could start there. Farbrengen, div Rab Meir, that is the opinion of Rab Meir, who we want to say for now what it means is that Rab Meir holds a breira, and Rab Meir says that you can do this, that when you get home, you'll separate all these logs for truma, for meiser, and we'll say that worked out perfectly. the Meiser was meant to be Meiser, the Truma was meant to be Truma, and whatever you drank was meant to be Chulin. Everything was Min HaShamayim, everything worked out perfectly. Reb Yehuda, Reb Yossi, Reb Shimon Osrin. But Reb Yehuda, Reb Shimon, and Reb Yossi, Reb Meir's colleagues, disagree. They say you're not allowed to do that. So we want to say, what does it mean that they, including Reb Yehuda, disagree? It means that they disagree with the concept of Brera. Reb Yehuda does not hold the Brera. He says, no, you can't do that. You can't just say that when you get home and you separate these 2 logs and 10 logs, those were the ones that were all along supposed to be Truma, were supposed to be Meiser. No, this is Tevel. It's Tevel until you actually separate the Trumas and Meisers. Until then, it's Tevel. You can't just you go home and separate it and say, oh, wow, everything worked out perfectly. No. However, says the Gemara, that brisa is not going to prove it. Because the reason in that brisa for the disagreement is not whether you hold Brera or not. You could say that they all hold a Brera, including Rabbi Yehuda. From that brisa alone, you could argue Rabbi Yehuda also holds a Brera. In principle, he has no problem with Reuven going when he gets home to Beersheba. He has no problem with Reuven going into his house and separating the 2 loaves and the 10 loaves and perfect. Wow, Truma, Meister, everything worked out amazingly. In principle, Rabbi Yehuda doesn't have a problem with that. However, they said to Reb Meir, but Reb Meir, they're on a long trip in a wagon. What happens if they hit a bump and the barrel goes flying and it falls out of the carriage and it falls onto the floor and it breaks in half and you lose all the wine and you lose the opportunity to go home and separate Trumas and Meisters? You lost that entire opportunity. You never separated Trumas and Meisters. You never will separate Trumas and Meisters. The wine is gone. And Mimele, what about all your l'chaims? What about all the wine that you drank? Tevel. That's their concern. They're okay with if everything works out perfectly, they get to Beersheba and then he separates all the logs, no problem. Brera. But what we're concerned about is that what if the barrel breaks before you have an opportunity to separate all the Trumas and Meisters? That's what they're concerned about. Therefore they say, no, we don't like it. Reb Meir says to them, Reb Meir says, I'll worry about it when it happens. Reb Meir says, I'll worry about it when it happens. Right now, you have 2 Yidden who want to have a Fabrengen. I'm not going to stop them. And therefore, right now they have a barrel full of wine. It's not cracked. Let him say, when I get home, I'll separate everything and it will all be great. Reb Meir has no problem with that. Okay, but where are we at? As far as we're concerned, everyone agrees with Brera, including Rabbi Yehuda as of now. And it was a kind of Facebook meta issue, which was about what if the barrel breaks. So we still need to prove, and that proof is coming, that Rabbi Yehuda does not hold a Brera. Now we mamish get to an Eruvin sugya. Eruvin. Do you remember Eruvin? Unbelievable. I think time heals. At the end of Eruvin, sheesh, I wasn't sure that I would recover. So at the end of Eruvin, I remember feeling like I had lost my cheshek for learning. I had enough. It was so technical. I had enough. Hopefully that won't be my experience next time. But hopefully that won't be my experience next time. I hopefully it won't be my experience next time. But anyways, I'm definitely enjoying this sugya right here. Eruv techumin. Unbelievable. Rather, it's like Eyo teaches. We have a friend of ours here in Nachlot named Eyo. The Tani Eyo teaches Rabbi Yehuda Omer. I'm going to read through this Gemara, I think, and then we're going to explain. There's a lot to explain here. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, ein adam masne al shnei dvarim ke'echad. A person cannot make a t'nai on 2 things at the same time. Elim b'chacham la mizrach, eruva la mizrach, l'marav eruva l'marav, v'lechan u'lechan lo. Ve'avinan ba ma'ashne lechan u'lechan tilo de ein brera mizmachu marav nami ein brera v'omer Rabbi Yochanan uchvar ba chacham. This is talking about Eruv techumin. Does anybody want to volunteer to tell everybody what Eruv techumin is? What's Tchum Shabbos? So of course on Shabbos, you are only allowed to walk 2,000 amah in a 2,000 amah radius from where you're konesh shvisa, from where you are considered to have spent Shabbos. That effectively depends where you are, let's say, when Shabbos begins. So if I'm here in Yerushalayim when Shabbos begins, so I could go anywhere outside of Yerushalayim 2,000 amas in any direction. Givaldik. So now, let's say we have 3 cities. We're going to call them Ruvain the city, Shimon the city, and Levi the city. And between each city, so you have Ruvain the city, and 4,000 amas later, you have Shimon the city, and 4,000 amas later, you have Levi the city. Now you have a Pashat Yid. Our Pashat Yid lives in Shimon the city. How can our Pashat Yid travel from Shimon the city to Ruvain the city on Shabbos? After all, it's 4,000 amas away. His Tchum Shabbos maxes out at 2,000 amas. Well, there is a solution, and that solution is called Eruv techumin. What our Pashat Yid can do is before Shabbos, he can walk smack into the middle between the 2 cities. And there, he will leave mazon shtei sudas, enough food there for 2 meals for 2 sudas. And when he does this before Shabbos, and when Shabbos comes in, it would be considered like he was spending Shabbos in between the 2 cities. Even though when Shabbos comes in, he was in his home in Shimon the city. But because before Shabbos, he set up an Eruv techumin halfway between Shimon the city and Ruvain the city, right? He lives in Shimon the city. And when Shabbos comes in, he's in Shimon the city. But because before Shabbos, he set up Eruv techumin, this mazon shtei sudas between Shimon the city and Ruvain the city, and his Eruv techumin was halfway between the 2 cities, so it will be considered that he was konesh shvisa. It would be considered that when Shabbos comes in, where is he spending Shabbos? Halfway between Shimon the city and Ruvain the city. Which means that halfway mark, that halfway point is going to define where his Tchum Shabbos essentially starts from, right? Where the center of his radius of Tchum is. I feel like that wasn't the most amazing way to explain it, but basically it'll be like, essentially we'll treat it like he's spending Shabbos halfway in between the 2 cities, which means that he could walk 2,000 amas in either direction from the halfway mark, where his mazon shtei sudas is. Which means that from the halfway mark, he could walk 2,000 amas back to Shimon the city. He can also walk from Shimon the city to the halfway mark. And he can also continue walking past the halfway mark, 2,000 more amas, towards Ruvain the city. And that way, because, right, by being konesh shvisa, halfway in the middle, he can effectively now walk from Shimon the city 2,000 amas to where he's being konesh shvisa, where his Eruv techumin is, and another 2,000 amas to get to Ruvain the city. Now, why would he want to do this? Because there's a tzaddik coming to town. There's a tzaddik coming to town. Now, here's the thing. I mentioned Levi the city as well. Levi the city is also 4,000 amas in the other direction from Shimon the city, and you could do the same thing for Levi the city. Now, there's a tzaddik who's coming to town. Unfortunately, he's not coming to Shimon the city. He's coming to either Ruvain the city or Levi the city. He's going to be in one of them, and he's not yet sure. He doesn't yet know which one it's going to be. He heard a rumor that there's a tzaddik coming to the area. He doesn't yet know, is that tzaddik going to be in Ruvain the city? Is he going to be in Levi the city? But he knows he's going to be in one of them. So before Shabbos, our Pashat Yid, he gets mazon shtei sudas, and he goes halfway between Shimon the city and Ruvain the city, and he places his Mazon Shtei Sudas over there is enough food for 2 meals, places it there. He then goes halfway between Shimon the city and Levi the city, and he places his Mazon Shtei Sudas halfway between Shimon the city and Levi the city, and he has that set up in advance over there. And the idea is that this Pashut Yid wants to be able to go on Shabbos afternoon to the Farbrengen with the tzaddik. So the idea is wherever the tzaddik is going to be for Shabbos, right? The assumption for now, right now we're assuming, and it's ultimately what we're going to assume, that the tzaddik, he's going to be there before Shabbos already. He's going to arrive before Shabbos. So this Pashut Yid doesn't know, is he spending the Shabbos in Ruvain the city, in Levi the city? He doesn't know this. But rest assured, when Shabbos comes in, the tzaddik is going to be in one of the cities. So let's say that when Shabbos comes in, the tzaddik is in Ruvain the city. So Givaldig. So when Shabbos comes in, it'll be considered like our Pashut Yid is Kone Shvisa. It'll be considered like he's spending Shabbos halfway between Shimon the city and Ruvain the city. And that way, the next day after Shachris, our Pashut Yid can walk over from Shimon the city to Ruvain the city to have a Farbrengen with this great tzaddik. We didn't have to rely on any breira. There's no Min HaShamayim, perfect, everything worked perfectly. There's none of that yet. Quite simply, our Pashut Yid wants to be with the tzaddik. Whichever city the tzaddik is in when Shabbos comes in this case, Shabbos comes in, our tzaddik is in Ruvain the city. Therefore, the Eruv techumin that is between Shimon the city and Ruvain the city is Kona Shvisa for our Pashut Yid. And tomorrow, right, so now at Shul on Friday night, the Pashut Yid hears, the tzaddik is in Ruvain the city. The Pashut Yid says, great, I already have an Eruv techumin set up for, right, and since the tzaddik was there when Shabbos came in, that Eruv techumin was Kona Shvisa, and he can walk to Ruvain the city for the Farbrengen the next day. Now, what about the following scenario? What about if there are 2 tzaddikim coming to town? One tzaddik is going to be in Ruvain the city, and the other tzaddik is going to be in Levi the city. And our Pashut Yid who lives in Shimon the city, he wants to keep his options open. Mamish, he wishes he could dance at 2 chasanas, but he can't. And he's going to have to make a decision, and he defers the decision. He says, maybe let me wait. Let me see how I'm feeling on Shabbos, and I'll make a last-minute decision if I want to go to the tzaddik in Ruvain the city or the tzaddik in Levi the city. And so again, before Shabbos, he goes halfway between the 2 cities, but halfway between Shimon the city and Ruvain the city, and he puts an Eruv techumin there, goes halfway between Shimon the city and Levi the city, he puts his Eruv techumin there. That way he's got everything in place, so that the next day on Shabbos after Shul, he'll be able to decide which Farbrengen he wants to go to. And in this case, it would be breira, right? In this case, based on what he decides, not when Shabbos comes in, but based on what he decides after Shul, after Shachris and Shabbos morning, he'll make a decision. You know what? I'm going to go to the tzaddik in Ruvain the city, and then it'll be like when Shabbos came in, Ashkacha Pratis, everything worked out. Milchatchila, it was meant to be from the beginning that when Shabbos came in, this Mazon Shtei Sudas, halfway between Shimon the city and Ruvain the city, when Shabbos came in, that's where our Pashut Yid was Kona Shvisa, and now the Pashut Yid can go from Shimon the city to Ruvain the city. Based on his decision that he's making after Shachris on Shabbos, we're going to go back and say, the whole time it was meant to be from already the time that Shabbos came in, that was the Eruv techumin, that is the place where he was Kona Shvisa when Shabbos came in. We're going to say breira, that everything worked out perfectly, and the Eruv techumin for Ruvain the city is the one that he can rely on. That would be relying on breira, right, based on the fact that he's choosing after Shachris on Shabbos. Now, there's going to be another little twist here that I didn't get to, but we'll get to it in the Gemara, but let us read through this. I'm going to chop a shluck of tea. It's a very intense stuff. There's a lot that needs to be explained on this stuff, particularly with breira. Breira is like moving pieces in breira, but it is very gewaldig. Eruvin. We haven't learned Eruvin in years. The Tani Eyo teaches Rabbi Yehuda Omer, says Rabbi Yehuda, Ein Adam masne al shnei dvarim kechad. So that last scenario that we gave, where there was a tzaddik in Reuven the city and a tzaddik in Levi the city, and our Pashut or Yid just wants to put out 2 Eruv techumin, one in each direction, so that he could decide after Shabbos where he wants to go. Ein adam masne al shnei dvarim kechad. A person can't do that. That would be breira. Can't do it. No breira. Ella, rather, what can he do? The first scenario, where there was a tzaddik, there was one tzaddik coming, Ella in ba chacham lemizrach, and if the tzaddik was going to be spending Shabbos in Reuven the city, Eruv lemizrach. So again, the Pashut Yid didn't know where the tzaddik was going to be spending Shabbos, so he put out 2 Eruv techumins, one in between Shimon the city and Reuven the city, one in between Shimon the city and Levi the city. He put out Eruv techumin in either direction. And Ela ba chacham lemizrach, and if it turns out that the tzaddik is spending Shabbos in Reuven the city, and in shul Friday night somebody tells him, you heard the tzaddik is in Reuven the city, and the Pashut Yid says, Givaldik, okay, great. That means that when Shabbos comes in, the tzaddik was in Reuven the city, he's kona shvisa in that direction, perfect. L'mariv Reuven l'mariv, and if the tzaddik ended up going to Levi the city, great. So that Eruv techumin is going to work. V'lechan lo. But you can't have it both ways. When there's 2 tzaddikim, one in Reuven the city, one in Levi the city, our Pashut Yid can't say, I'll decide tomorrow after shul which one I want to go to, and everything will just work out perfectly. Why does Rabbi Yehuda say, when there's 2 tzaddikim, you can't just decide the next day? Because ein breira. So mizrach u'mariv nami ein breira. So shouldn't we also say in the other scenario when there's 1 tzaddik? So here there's a new angle that I don't want to get stuck on it. But let's just the Gemara is assuming at this moment that the Gemara is assuming at this moment that the tzaddik hadn't actually arrived yet in Reuven the city when Shabbos came in, and therefore when Shabbos came in, he wasn't yet in Reuven the city. So we don't necessarily. How do we know that he's actually going to arrive at Reuven the city? And therefore, how do we know that our Pashut Yid's Eruv techumin will actually be kona shvisa when Shabbos comes in, since at that time the tzaddik had not yet actually arrived at the city? So how could our Pashut Yid's Eruv techumin be working? Isn't it based on the fact that when the tzaddik eventually arrives at the city on Shabbos, we'll say that we'll treat it like he was there when Shabbos came in, and the Eruv will be kona shvisa. No. Says Rabbi Yochanan, no. When we say that when there's 1 tzaddik, he could rely upon the Eruv techumin, it's because the tzaddik had already arrived at the Reuven the city when Shabbos came in. He wasn't coming in on Shabbos. Shabbos came in, he was already staying at his host, wherever he was staying. Shabbos came in, he was already in Reuven the city. Therefore, that's why the Eruv in that direction is going to be kona shvisa, because no breira required. But when there's 2 tzaddikim, one in Reuven the city, one in Levi the city, and our Pashut Yid wants to choose the next day which city he wants to go to, that won't work. We won't say breira. Friends, so what do we see from here? We see from here that according to Rabbi Yehuda, breira is not an option. And therefore what? Well, Reb Abba wanted to say, if you remember, the nevela for the dogs, and he had said that, well, the sheep are not necessary, right? Because Abaye wanted to say that, well, you see, the sheep is for human eating, not for dog eating, but in terms of on Shabbos, it's for human eating before Shabbos, for human eating on Shabbos. And then Rabbi Abba said, no, it's for breeding. But then how do you eat it? Then how can you slaughter it on Yom Tov? We say, well, it's for breeding and for eating. When you slaughter it, then we say breira. That whole argument of Rabbi Abba to say that a sheep is both for breeding and for eating, and that when you then slaughter it on Yom Tov, Memela, we can go back and say all along it was meant for eating, that relies on breira. And if we're saying that this shita of Rav, who says that you're not allowed to eat this animal that was slaughtered on Shabbos, and we're saying that's based on Rabbi Yehuda, and that old shita is based on, essentially that old malach is based on assuming that Rabbi Yehuda holds a breira. Rabbi Yehuda doesn't hold a breira, as we just proved from the sugya in Eruvin, and therefore we are going to have to find a new shita of Rabbi Yehuda that Rab is going based on. Elam Rav Yosef, rather says Rav Yosef, Rabbi Yehuda de Kalim he. Okay, it's the shita of Rabbi Yehuda when it comes to vessels, muksa vessels on Shabbos at time. We learn in a Mishnah Masechta Shabbos, Kol HaKelim Anitolin b'Shabbos. So if you have a vessel that is mutter on Shabbos, like a bowl, for example, you're allowed to use a bowl on Shabbos. Shivreyan Nitalin. What if that bowl breaks? That's okay, you could still use it. It's not muksa, you could still use the pieces. Uvilvad sheyuhu osin me'ein milacha. But they have to be useful for something. So if you have a bowl and the bowl breaks, and now there are shards, there's pieces of the bowl, you can no longer use the pieces as a bowl. But you can put it on top of a vessel or something to cover it. You can find some use for it. As long as you can find some use for it, then it is not muksa, it's usable, it's okay on Shabbos. Shivrei areva lechasos ben pichavis, for example, if you have a big bowl that you use for mixing dough and that bowl breaks, but you can use the pieces to cover a barrel. Shivrei zchuchis, or pieces of glass, lechasos ben pi apach, that you can use to cover the opening of a flask. In these cases, it's fine. It's not muksa. You can move it. You can do whatever you want with it on Shabbos, even though they aren't usable anymore for their initial purpose, but they are still usable, and that's fine. Rabbi Yehuda Omer says, Rabbi Yehuda, Uvachu osin me'ein melachton. No. Rabbi Yehuda disagrees, and he says that they still need to be usable for their original purpose. Shive'areva latzuk l'sochen mikpa. A bowl, if you have a big bowl that was used as a bowl, it has to still be usable as a bowl. And so long as you can maybe still take a porridge and put it into the piece, and the piece will still be able to, it's big enough and round enough that it can still hold whatever thick porridge you put in there, then it would be okay. Shivez chuches, and pieces of glass, latzuk l'sochen shemen, to be able to put some oil in them, right? So Rabbi Yehuda disagrees and says that these vessels, if they break, for you to continue being able to, for them to be mutter on Shabbos, they would have to maintain the same purpose that they had when Shabbos began. Me'ein melachton in, me'ein melach acheres lo. They have to retain the same purpose as they did when Shabbos began. This bowl that you're able to put things into it when Shabbos began, so long as you could still put some porridge into it, then it's not muksa. Then you can move it. It's mutter on Shabbos. If you can no longer put any kind of a porridge or anything in it, well, then it's muksa. Even though you could still use it to cover a barrel or whatever. But this is not the purpose it had when Shabbos began. Alma, therefore we see, Kaven delo itochen me'esmo lahach milacha, since this shard was not prepared when Shabbos began to be used for covering a vessel. Rather, at that point, it was still a bowl to be used for mixing things in. Asire, it's going to be also because of muktzah on Shabbos. Hachanami, therefore, by the animal that was slaughtered on Shabbos as well, came into itochen me'esmo, since it was not prepared, this animal, when Shabbos came in, was not to be used for, it was not ready to be eaten. So asura, so then you are not allowed to eat it on Shabbos. Since when Shabbos came in, it could not be eaten. When Shabbos came in, it was still alive. So therefore, it was not prepared before Shabbos, and you can't eat it on Shabbos. You have to wait till after Shabbos. But Abaye says to Rav Yosef, midami. But one second, those cases, that's not a very smooth comparison. One second. You had a bowl. The bowl broke. It's no longer a bowl. It's not usable for bowl things. It has taken on a new purpose. You can use it to cover a vessel. That's very different than when it was a bowl and you could mix things in it. No, you can do a very basic thing. You could put it on top of an opening in a vessel. That's it. It's a completely different purpose. V'avale nolad v'osur. It's nolad. It's got a completely new purpose. It went from being a bowl to being a barrel cover. This happened on Shabbos. It's nolad. It's taking on a new purpose. It's a new thing that was created on Shabbos, and it's osur. But by this animal, by the sheep, meikara ochla. When Shabbos started, it was food. Ulvasof ochel, and it's still food. On Shabbos, when it was shechted, it's still food. Uchla de ifrasu, it's food that you broke and food emerged from it. Right? Like for example, if you take maybe like a fruit. And do we have examples? Does it give it to? Yeah, here we go. Yeah, exactly. So for example, if you break a apple and juice comes out of the apple, so juice that emerged from the apple, as we're going to see in a minute, Rabbi Yehuda says could be okay. So here also, this is meat that kind of emerged. It's like you broke open the animal, so to speak, and this meat emerged from the animal. So Rabbi Yehuda would say it's okay. Meaning, okay, so we had the case of the vessel. Sure, Rabbi Yehuda says that when you have a bowl and the bowl breaks and it's no longer a bowl, so Rabbi Yehuda says it's muksa. Even though you could cover a barrel with it, but it's something else, it's muksa. However, argues Abaye, this animal, when Shabbos came in, it was food. It was alive, but it was food. On Shabbos, it was slaughtered. It's still food. You have this meat that emerged from the animal, that was extracted from the animal, but it was food when Shabbos started. It's still food now. We know that Rabbi Yehuda's opinion is the Amar uchla de ifras shaper dami, that food that emerges is completely fine. Disnan, that we learn in a Mishnah in Masechta Shabbos, ein sochatin es aperis lotzimein mashkin. You're not allowed to juice a fruit on Shabbos. You can't juice a fruit on Shabbos. You can't put a fruit in a juicer and make juice on Shabbos. Vim yatu me'atzman. What if the juice came out on its own? What if juice came out of the fruit on its own on Shabbos? Can you drink that? Asur, no, you can't. Rabbi Yehuda Omer. Rabbi Yehuda says, wait a second, maybe you can. Im la'ochlin. If you want to be eating this fruit, let's say you have an apple. You don't plan to juice the apples. You plan to eat the apples. So in that case, if some juice comes out of the apple, you're allowed to drink what comes out of it, because if the concern is that you then may end up saying, wow, this juice is delicious, I'm gonna squeeze all these apples and juice them. No, the point is that you want to be eating these apples. You don't want to be juicing these apples. So let's say cucumbers maybe is a better example. Right? The plan is to eat the cucumbers, dip them in trina, some cucumber juice on its own leaked out of the cucumber, so you could drink it. We're not concerned that you're going to end up juicing all of the cucumbers. Vim lemashkin, but if you have an orange and the plan was to juice all the oranges, and then some juice came out of the orange, hayotzimen also, then you're not allowed to juice. You're not allowed to drink that juice on Shabbos that came out on its own, because we're concerned that, wow, you might really enjoy that juice and then end up juicing all of the oranges. So we see that according to Rabbi Yehuda, this juice that emerges from the cucumbers, you can eat. And therefore we'll want to say, because you weren't planning to juice it, you're planning to eat the cucumbers, and therefore any juice that emerged, we're not concerned that you're now going to go and juice all of the cucumbers. And also, we want to argue that according to Rabbi Yehuda, this meat so somebody slaughtered this animal, and now you have this meat that's coming from the animal. Rabbi Yehuda would say that you'd be able to eat the meat. We're not concerned that now you're going to slaughter all these other animals. No, you have this meat, you'd be able to eat it. But one second. Labid Marla, but was it not stated about it? Rabbi Yehuda says, Rabbi Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, so Rabbi Yehuda named Shmuel, Modeh Rabbi Yehuda, that Rabbi Yehuda, however, would admit, Lechachamim, Bisale Zeisim Va'anovim, that when it comes, however, to grapes and olives, those are classic extraction fruits. Extract the oil, extract the juice for wine. When it comes, Rabbi Yehuda admits, however, says Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel, that Rabbi Yehuda admits that when it comes to, that there are exceptions. When it comes to olives, when it comes to grapes, you can't drink the oil/juice that emerges from them, because since they are things that are generally recognized as juicing things, as things that you would extract their liquid from them, you can't, right? We are concerned that if you drink the whatever comes out of them, you might end up, squeezing them, pressing them. So Alma came to the schita kaime yoiv daite, that since these are things that are inherently squeezable and juiceable, so therefore you're not allowed to consume the juice that comes from them, because you might then end up squeezing all of them. So Achanami came to the shchita kaima yoiv daite. Therefore, we should say the same thing here by the meat and say that it is not allowed, since this sheep, right? We're saying it's food, right? Because as we said, it has to be for food, because otherwise, how can you shecht it on Yom Tov? So it has to be that it's for food. Earlier, Babble wanted to say it's for food, for eating, and for breeding and brera, but we said you can't say brera, so it's for food. So therefore, so this sheep was always meant to be for food, and now it was shechted. So we would say that just like when it comes to olives and grapes, that generally are, their purpose is for extracting their juice, and you can't drink their juice that comes from them on Shabbos. So also the meat from this animal that Milchatchila was for eating, you would be unable to eat the meat. However, and with this we're going to leave on a cliffhanger, Midu Taimel Rav, we are trying to define Rav. If you remember from the very beginning of the Gemara, Rav had said that when somebody shechs on Shabbos, you have to wait till after Shabbos. So we're saying that this is like Rab Yehuda. So this, right, the Rav is saying like Rab Yehuda. So we're explaining this to try to understand Rav's shita. Ha'omar Rav, but Rav said, Rav actually disagrees with that sentiment and says that Rabbi Yehuda disagrees even by grapes and by olives. Rabbi Yehuda would say that even by grapes and by olives, you can eat any liquid that emerges on its own. And therefore, I would argue that if somebody slaughters an animal, a sheep on Shabbos, that meat can be eaten. We're not concerned that you're going to now slaughter all these other animals. Friends, we're going to leave it here, shtickle cliffhanger, because we still have not figured out what the scenario is where Rabbi Yehuda, that based on Rabbi Yehuda, we would say that you'd be unable to eat this meat on Shabbos, that you'd have to wait till after Shabbos when an animal was slaughtered on Shabbos, because we just said based on the fruit, the juice that emerges from fruit, Rabbi Yehuda would say that so long as the intention was to be eating these fruits rather than juicing them, so then you would be able to drink the juice, you'd be able to consume the juice without a concern that you're not going to go juice all of them. So you're also, I would argue that you'd be able to eat the meat. We're not concerned that you're going to now slaughter all of the animals. So therefore, again, what is the shita of Rabbi Yehuda, that based on that, Rav would say that you're unable to eat the meat until after Shabbos? We're going to hold it here because there's still a lot more to go. We're in the middle of this sugya. But wow, that was some daf. Wow, Daf Yudal of Masechta Chullin, Daf 14 was a real throwback to the early days of Babble on Talmud. Sugyas from Shabbos, sugyas from Eruv, shtickle beya in there. Unbelievable. The main sugya really that we were discussing is eating an animal that was slaughtered on Shabbos, also on Yom Kippur. Though of course you're not going to be eating it on Yom Kippur. But we said that the Mishnah says that the animal is kosher even though there's a chiyuv misa. And Rav says that when it comes to Shabbos, you have to wait until after Shabbos. The shaila is, why does he say that? We want to say that it's based on Rabbi Yehuda. We then spent the rest of the daf trying to figure out what shita of Rabbi Yehuda it is that, based on that, we would be unable to eat the meat until after Shabbos. We had initially seen, I didn't put it here, we had initially seen a machlokas between the Chacham and Rabbi Yehuda about can you feed nevela to your dog on Shabbos. Rabbi Yehuda says that you cannot, since the nevela, the animal was still alive when Shabbos began, and we tried to explain that based on brera, that we wanted to say that the reason that you can't eat that the nevela cannot be fed to the dog is because essentially, the the reason why that meat, that animal cannot be fed to the dogs, because when Shabbos began, it was not meant for dog food. It was meant, Babble wanted to argue, for breeding, not for dog food. Anyways, we then got into a whole discussion of Breira. We discussed the famous brisa that discussed separating tithes from wine of a kuti. Reb Meir says you can do it via Breira and say that when I get home, I'll separate everything I need to separate, and now I can drink the wine, it'll be considered Chullin. Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Shimon said you cannot do it via Breira out of concern that the barrel may break. So they don't have an issue with Breira per se, but they are concerned that the barrel may break. We then moved on. We proved this from Eruv techumin, right? The Eruv techumin to see a visiting tzaddik. Rabbi Yehuda says if you have two tzaddikim, one in city Reuven and one in city Levi, you can't just decide after shul on Shabbos whichever one you feel like. You can't say Breira, which would then say that, okay, when Shabbos came in, that must have been the Eruv techumin that I wanted to rely on. You can't say that. So that proved that Rabbi Yehuda does not hold Breira, which undid Rabbi Abba's suggestion that sheep are both for breeding and for eating, and that when you slaughter it on Yom Tov, we could say that it's that Breira and it was really meant for eating, etc. Rabbi Yosef had suggested that the shita of Rabbi Yehuda is based on handling broken vessels on Shabbos. According to the Chachamim, you can handle broken vessels on Shabbos, mutter, as long as it remains usable for something. So if you have a big bowl that broke and now it's no longer usable as a bowl, but it could be put on a vessel, on top of an opening of a vessel, so then that is sufficient, it's not muksa. Rabbi Yehuda says it is muksa. It's only not muksa, it's only mutter if it's usable for the same purpose. So as long as you'd still be able to put at least some kind of thick porridge into this shard, then that is okay. So we wanted to say that based on that, we see that according to Rabbi Yehuda, things have to be, when Shabbos comes in, for the purpose that they're going to, right? So this animal, when Shabbos came in, it wasn't for eating. It was still alive. But then Abaye argued that no, when Shabbos came in, it was for eating, and now you slaughter it, it's still for eating, and it should just be considered like drinking fruit juice on Shabbos. So juicing is asur, but when juice comes out on its own, the Chacham say it's asur, but Rabbi Yehuda says mutter when the intention was to eat the fruits. Also when the intention was to juice the fruits, but so long as the intention was to eat the fruits, if any juice comes out on its own, then it would be mutter to consume that juice. We want to say that therefore also this meat that emerges from this animal should be permitted, right? You're not allowed to slaughter it, but if somebody did slaughter it, so this meat that comes from this animal should be permitted to eat. So what would be the shita of Rabbi Yehuda, that based on that shita you would not be allowed to eat the meat until after Shabbos? Well, I'll have to catch you tomorrow in order to see. Have a great day. Cheers.